Good evening and welcome. My name is Jocelyn and I am a TA for LSAT Unplugged with Steve Schwartz. Tonight I'll be your host for this hour. Let me introduce the guests for this evening and then we'll dive in. It is my pleasure to welcome to the LSAT Unplugged community, Greg Canada, the Assistant Dean of Admissions at Indiana Maurer School of Law. Dean Canada has devoted his entire professional career serving higher education, in addition to working in various student service positions as a graduate student. He has spent almost 20 years in undergraduate, graduate, and law school admissions. Beyond his current responsibilities as the Assistant Dean of Admissions at Indiana Law, Dean Canada has been actively involved with LSAT, the Hispanic Scholarship Fund, CLEO, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Millennium Scholarship Program. Prior to joining Indiana Law in 2015, he worked as the Assistant Dean of Admissions at UC Hastings College of Law in San Francisco, California. Welcome, Dean Canada.
Thank you, Jocelyn.
Thank you for joining me today. Can you tell our viewers a little bit more about yourself and why you became an admissions dean with IU Maurer?
Well, I have to kind of go back to my time as an undergraduate when I was graduating from Virginia Wesleyan College in the mid-90s and looking at graduate programs in history and philosophy. A history professor approached me and suggested that if things didn't work for me in the graduate realm, at least in terms of my application, that I should consider doing an admissions stint working as a representative for my alma mater. And that's where I embarked upon my career in admissions. I was there for just 2 years, really enjoyed it, but felt that, again, my desire to go to graduate school was just too strong. So I went on to graduate school and then made my way from Boston to California in the late 90s. I initially had the hope to teach, but couldn't find a really good job teaching, and I fell back into admissions. But at that time, I got into graduate admissions, and I was working at a school in San Francisco called the California Institute of Integral Studies, which was a graduate school of psychology and humanities. A friend of mine worked at UC Hastings, and we used to do a recruitment stints together, and she mentioned a job was opening up at UC Hastings, and she encouraged me to apply, and this was in 2005. I applied, and they must have liked what they saw, and it's been a trip ever since.
Wow, that is incredible. And so you've now transitioned to IU Maurer. It's the 9th oldest law school in the United States. Am I getting that correct? And the oldest public law school in the Midwest. I got to underscore that. That's amazing. Actually, so I'm a little bit biased. I actually graduated from IUPUI.
Okay.
In 2020. So, I gotta say you are representing what IU is encompassing so well. And can you talk a little bit about the culture? Even though I went to IUPUI, I did have a lot of intersection with IU Bloomington. I actually did a semester in Washington through one of the political science pilot programs and had a fantastic experience working on the Hill. So, but that was just undergrad, but like IU Maurer, like that's on a whole nother level. So can you talk about the culture, the humbleness, the caring of the community and within the community? Can you talk about that?
Sure. Well, I remember when I was interviewing, and then later when I accepted the job at Maurer, when I was walking around the halls there in Barrow Hall, I was struck by how friendly the students were, not necessarily to me, but to one another. And that was not what I was accustomed to. My time at Hastings, and I loved my time at UC Hastings. I felt the students were fairly typical of what you would find at a law school, fairly competitive, really kind of kept to themselves. And I just noticed that Maurer, it just felt a little different. And my first thought was that this must be what it's like in the Midwest. Just people are just friendlier in the Midwest. And this is basically what I signed up for. But as I've explored that question further, I realized that the culture of the law school isn't really so much tied to the fact that we are in the Midwest. And I think it plays some part. But I would talk to admitted students who'd come to visit Maurer. I meet with every admitted student who comes to visit the law school. And I talk to them about the schools that they're interested in and, what their experiences have been like visiting visiting those other schools. And it was there that I realized what was happening at Maurer was not something that was kind of emblematic of what life was like for law students in the Midwest, because a lot of these students would come back and say, well, no, Dean Canada, that school that I visited down the road was just as competitive, as cutthroat as I would expect any law school to be. So I realized it was something else that was going on at Maurer that gave it that distinctive collegial environment. And I think two things that come to mind that I realized. Part of it is life in Bloomington. Compared to my life in San Francisco, where the rents are very high, commutes are nasty, you have urban grind. Those three elements are not part of the experience of not only our students, but the people who live in Bloomington and work at IU. And when you take those sorts of things away, those kind of gratuitous stresses, students can be a little more present. They're not always in a hurry to make the train, or they're always thinking about where else they have to be. And so I realized a lot of it, about the quality of my own life, being a family man, and what it was like for me in Bloomington. I saw this kind of playing out with our students. Our students weren't sweating the cost of attendance. They weren't, having to deal with the grind of urban life, and they weren't competing with one another just to get to class to find the few parking spots that that might be available to law students. I also realized, though, we also played a very important part in the admissions office in shaping the culture of the law school. And I took it upon myself to make sure that whatever I did in my tenure at Maurer, I wasn't going to upend what I found at Maurer, and that is that collegial student environment. So we really did make an effort. And I think this was very much what my predecessors have done, is that when reviewing applications, we're not simply looking for good students. We are looking for great classmates. That's an important element in the review process at Maurer, and we do think that contributes a lot to the kind of student body and the culture we have at the law school. The students who select to join us also want to be part of an environment where they don't feel that their success in law school is somehow threatened by the success of their classmates, that they actually see their successes as being intimately connected to the success of their classmates. And so it's a tide that lifts all boats, that not the spoils of combat. That's kind of a part, I think, is a distinctive feature of of Maurer in the collegial student environment you'll find there.
You said it so eloquently and so perfectly. And that's what I experienced at the undergrad, but to hear you share that experience and perspective at the law school level, I think is very powerful. Let's talk about the programs that you guys have. So my understanding is that your tax program is ranked 15th in the nation, and then you got intellectual property 28th, right? So that collegiality, is that I guess somewhat connected to the fantastic rankings that you have? Can you kind of expound on that, if there's a connection?
I don't know if there really is. I don't think the way Bob Morris and the folks at the U.S. News rank law schools take stock of the culture of the law school. It's not something, I don't think you can find a correlation between the high ranking of a program and the collegiality of the student body. But let me say something, for example, about our tax law program. We have two of the most cited tax legal experts in the country working at Maurer, and they're not alone. You have a lot of other faculty who are very well cited, highly regarded amongst their peers. And despite their reputation in the legal academy, they're so down to earth, so approachable. And I think for very much the reasons that I alluded to earlier about, even my wife makes comment that I'm a friendlier person because I'm not stressed out as much living in that urban environment, racing commutes, which were hellish in the Bay Area. When you take those sorts of things out, those stresses away, people just can be a little more friendly. But that was this thing that struck me. I think besides the beauty of the campus in Bloomington, it is one of the most beautiful college campuses, that you'll find, and the friendliness of our students. The thing that really stuck out to me, in addition to those things, was just how affable and friendly the faculty members were, despite their intellectual prowess. So while I don't think it's connected to the rankings, I actually find it a bit, it's a fascinating aspect that you'd have such luminaries in their respective fields who were so friendly, so kind, and so approachable. That a lot of times those aren't connected in the way that I've come to experience it, and it's been a wonderful surprise having these colleagues who I work with at Maurer, who are doing incredible things throughout the legal academy, but who really do take the time to be present with their students, who are always willing to help the admissions office when it comes to meeting with prospective students or just getting out there to talk about the programs. So again, it's one of those things that I was pleasantly surprised, and to this day, I think being a huge credit to Maurer about the faculty members being so approachable and friendly.
That's awesome. We're going to switch gears to COVID, right? There's nothing that's gone unscathed by COVID. We know that, law admissions process, actually, there was an increase of applications, during COVID, and there were multiple reasons. So I'm curious to know, how has COVID impacted Maurer?
Well, if anything, there are long-term impacts, but there were immediate impressions. One thing that Maurer did was something that I don't know of any other law school doing when COVID was really, really at its peak. And that is, we gave our students an option between being in person or online. And we actually we structured the first year curriculum so that they were in blocks. So instead of taking all your 1L courses in the fall semester for 15 weeks, we actually broke them up into about 4-week chunks so that you were just taking one class at a time. And at each section, every time you had a break between your block, let's say you finished 4 weeks of civil procedure, you then were given another choice about whether or not you want to continue online or if you wanted to be in person, in order to give our students the maximum amount of flexibility. Now, we really went out of our way to make this happen. No other law school that I know of did something and went that far to meet the students where they're at. We do take pride in the fact that we have a beautiful college campus. We're nicely situated on the corner of this gorgeous campus. We know that's a big draw for a lot of students to come to Maurer because of the bucolic, surroundings. But the fact that, we knew that a lot of students would also be very uncomfortable about being online, and we know that things could change over the course of the semester. So we wanted to do whatever we could to ensure that students would be given the chance to be online if they felt that was the best way to go for them, but also be in person if they wanted to. It was a lot of legwork on our part. It was not easy to administer, but if anything, it really reflects the commitment that the law school has to supporting our students wherever they may be. Now, in terms of long-term impact, I do think that, I can only speak anecdotally, or really from our perspective. There was a semester, we're very close to the classes at the law school, but the incoming class of 2021, I still don't think we ever felt the connection that we've had with previous classes or classes after that. We've made long strides to be connected with this group, but I think they themselves felt like their experience was going to be very different, given the fact that many of them weren't in class with one another, or that they were doing a lot of studying outside of the law school. They couldn't be in the building for a lot of the time. So in terms of long-term effects, I hear the other thing too is I do think one thing that has stood out is that for the longest time, law faculty at Maurer and well outside the law school felt that you simply couldn't teach what they were teaching online. I think that they have realized that no, with the technology that we have now, that you can actually have a robust 1L course, or any class for that matter at law school, online, and it has gotten many of the faculty thinking about offering some of these courses online, so that people who can't come to Bloomington but want to participate at the law school in some capacity would be able to do so. So I see a little bit of that going on, but I'd say the big thing, if anything, what it told me is just what an amazing law school I work at. Just their willingness to go, that extra mile to support our students. That to me was probably the biggest thing I walked away with during our COVID shutdown.
Wow. Now, the ability to take a course in 4 weeks, for doing it one at a time blocks, that is unheard of. That is incredible. I've not heard from some of the interviews that I've conducted, and I've listened to quite a few admissions interviews as well, just from different platforms. That is incredibly unique, and what a treasure.
Yeah, now they did this because let's say you caught COVID, if
Yeah,
you were taking a class, you were taking 4 classes at a time and you were out for 2 weeks, that could really set you back. And some
absolutely.
students would actually be forced to maybe take a withdrawal for the semester. So that this was basically, no matter what happened, you could, you'd be able to withstand, if you had to withdraw, drop one class because you got COVID really bad, that wouldn't sink your entire semester.
Wow, that's incredible. And how thoughtful. Going back to
Yeah.
the caring, the collegiality there, and it's notorious in this space to have the feeling of a school doesn't really care. It's about the grades, it's about the competition and
Mhm.
making it. But to see that speaks volumes. A follow-up question I have is, you know, now that we're kind of in this in between time, and you alluded to this, there might be some potentials for some classes to be held virtually, um to accommodate. Do you see, foresee another, I guess, cycle of students, influx of students, it getting busier, essentially, where you have more students that end up applying? Or do you see this like trend, right, of things kind of slowing down, or we're kind of returning to where we were in 2019 with the influx of students that would, come in or apply, um, versus be admitted during the.
Well, there's been a leveling off with the applications, no doubt
Okay.
about. Last year, we saw a decrease both at the law school and nationally, and so we're starting to see the interest starting to wane. But that can all change. There's a lot of talk now about a recession, and we know that typically professional schools have done well, with the exception of the 2008, 2010 recession, which really hit the legal industry hard. Typically these recessions have been good for professional schools. So it'll be interesting to see how this all plays out. We are all, so it's hard to say. I have my crystal ball is very, very cloudy, and it's really hard to see into the future.
Mhm.
We're anticipating a similar size application pool as we've had this past year. And that it's going to be another year of fierce competition amongst many outstanding law schools over a select group of students. But we're not anticipating anything drastically different than it was during the pandemic. The one thing I would say has changed is that before the pandemic, law school admissions professionals were out on the road, 15, 16, 18 weeks of the year, meeting face to face. During COVID, of course, that stopped cold turkey, and we went to using these platforms like Handshake and other things like Zoom to be able to meet with students. We thought this would be a carryover and something that would continue on even after we had an opportunity to go back on the road. And while some schools were still using those platforms, we're finding that students themselves do not prefer them. At least in our interactions, we're finding that if anything, you go to an event and there's a handshake, you're not going to have a chance to meet with many students. And a lot of law admissions professionals are deciding this is just not worth their time, and that they'd rather, even if it costs more money and exposes possibly to COVID infections, so that it'd be good to be back on the road. So we're back, and I would say full swing of things. The travel season isn't as intense as it was prior to COVID, at least not for me. But we're moving in that direction to kind of going back to, the handshakes and meeting people one-on-one, face-to-face.
Wow. Okay. I thought it would be more folks would be interested in being virtual, but from what you're saying, a lot of folks want to be face to face. Wow.
Now, this might be just my experience, and
I
so
mean, with your
yeah,
kids,
yeah.
right?
I mean, take for example, I bailed myself to our admitted students to Zoom if they wanted to meet with me. These are admitted students if they wanted just to have a 30-minute Zoom meeting with me. During the pandemic, it was okay. It was not the most popular thing for students to do, but I'll tell you, last year, I don't think I had one or two Zoom meetings with admitted students. Out of all the students, we met at 600 students last year. There were not, it was just not a way for them to engage with me. They would come to visit the law school. They came to the admitted student days or did individual visits, but they didn't rely on Zoom as a way to connect. It might be me, my experience, but what we thought would be a staple or a nice complement to what we've done in the past really is not shaking out. We're also doing like individual info sessions, like areas of interest, like on constitutional law and so forth. And we're finding that the attendance of those are not as strong as well. It might be a timing issue, but I just think that it's just the overall enthusiasm for prospective students to do virtual interaction just isn't there. And that's just my humble opinion.
Wow, okay. Speaking of, students and school interaction, I'm curious what your position on concerning students or prospective students that are looking to engage with the school. They're looking to reach out, they're, working on their personal statement, their LSAT score, all of those things, right? What would you say would be a good time for that student to reach out and start interacting with their prospective school?
Well, it depends really on where they are on their journey. If you're just exploring the law school, trying to get a feel for the kind of law school that might interest you, I think doing it while you're in college to start developing kind of a template, if you will, or a set of characteristics that will work for you, as opposed to qualities that may not work for you. And this is important because a lot of times students will simply look at U.S. News and make a decision based upon where they're going to apply on U.S. News and their LSAT scores, which is not a very good way of selecting law schools. So I always suggest to students who are early on in the process, just trying to get a sense about what law schools are like and trying to make some determinations that are meaningful to them about the kind of characteristics that will be good for them in a law school. Do it while they're in college or pretty early in the process. But then once you get admitted, your visit's going to be very different. I mean, at this point, you're not looking them it's like courtship, early dating, and then a little bit later on that, the dates are going to be a little different. Now I'm starting to size this person up and see really whether or not this is going to go anywhere or not. And you're looking at a commitment. Once you've been admitted, and you're making a slightly different decision than what you're doing when you're just scouting out law schools. You're looking at basically where you're going to be spending your next 3 years and where your legal career is going to begin. Because as the saying goes, your first day in the legal profession starts at orientation. So you're thinking about those sets of concerns. Now you've been admitted, and you might have been admitted to a number of schools that have those similar qualities. I applied to these 6 schools because they have X, Y, and Z. But now that I'm admitted, I'm going to be looking for these small differences that are going to make a big difference ultimately in the decision I make. So it really does depend on where you are in the process, but I strongly encourage students to take the time to visit. If you can't visit all the type of law, every law school that interests you, visit one that's in an urban setting, visit a large law school, visit a private school, visit one that's public, these different kind of characteristics, and then start teasing out the ones that are going to make the most difference for you. And then use that as kind of a way to winnow down the number of schools you're going to apply to, because schools are sending out fee waivers and enticements all the time to get people to apply. And it can be really, really overwhelming. And some students will apply to 15 schools because they just don't know, they all look good. But if you're taking the time to go visit schools and see for yourself the kind of qualities that make a difference to you, you're going to be able to sift through all those invitations and apply to the schools that are going to really be kind of offer the setting that gives you the most win in your sales. But yeah, go visiting the school when you've been admitted to, very important. And we make every effort to encourage students to come visit, whether it be individual visits, where again, you have a chance to meet with me. We'll put you up in a local hotel, or you can come during 2 of our admitted student days that we have in the spring.
Wow, that's awesome. We're going to switch gears a little bit to, okay, you're choosing the school, but there's the other side. The school has to choose you, right? And there's a process for that. So let's talk a little bit about the classic personal statement. What are some do's and don'ts? What are your top, 5 do's and top 5 don'ts for a personal statement?
Well, let me step back, and my bit of wisdom for people applying to law schools, I always tell them, think about this as being your first case. Okay, think of this as your first case. And with this case, there are 2 kind of sub cases you're trying to make. The first is that you have the academic chops. to be successful in a challenging, rigorous course of study. I think that's the one that everyone latches on to. It's easy, it's numeric, it's quantitative, it's the things that the ABA requires us to put out there. It's what the US News ranks us on. However, that's just part of the case that you're trying to make. The other part, and this is where the personal statement comes in for me, the case you're trying to make, the second case you're trying to make is not that you want to go to law school. I don't think that's good enough. I think the real, the good applicants are making the case that they were meant to go to law school. Okay. And then it's that personal statement that you're able to provide the committee, the admissions committee, this sense of you're answering a calling by taking this step, and you're outlining the steps in your life. You're kind of stretching and pruning the various experiences you've had in your life to give us the impression step by step that yes, this is it. You are meant to be at law school. Hopefully it's ours, but somewhere, somehow you're going to be in law school and answering a deep calling. That to me is the most important thing that this personal statement should capture. Now, things that I think are very important. Well, first of all, let me talk about the don'ts. First of all, one distinction I always make is this is a personal statement, not a statement of purpose. Okay, I worked in graduate admissions, and in graduate schools, they typically want a statement of purpose. What are you going to do with this degree? Who do you want to study with? What are you going to do once you graduate from this PhD program? It's very future oriented. A personal statement, however, is retrospective. It's outlining the unalterable path that brought you to this moment in your life where you're now going to embark upon, a legal career, etc. So I always say the orientation should be more past oriented and not future oriented. For one thing, in law school, most people's minds are going to change about what they're going to do with their law degree, and they'll change it within that first year. So we know it's very speculative in terms of what their future holds. And so it doesn't tell us much about them. But this is also where it can go wrong. A lot of times students, I think in my 18 years of doing law school admissions, only one student's told me that they want to go to law school to make money. Okay. Most people, no one in their right mind is going to say, the reason why I'm applying to law school is I work at a big law firm, to live a fairly affluent life, because I know attorneys can once they pay off the student loans. No one wants to do that because it speaks to the more base motives for people becoming attorneys. What they will say instead is that, again, they're talking about the future. They want to work on the margins of society. They want to give a voice to the voiceless. And that sounds wonderful because it appeals to the most noble aspirations of the legal profession. But as I mentioned earlier, this is your first case, and you have to be able to support that case. And if I look at that resume and I look at those recommendations and they show nothing that supports this aspiration, then I'm scratching my head and going, is this person being sincere? Sincerity is something you definitely want to achieve in writing your personal statement. It needs to be genuine. It needs to be authentic. It needs to be real. And so in this case here, when someone starts speculating about the future and oftentimes speaking about things that will pull on the heartstrings of any reader, then we have to step back and take a look and say, well, geez, how can you possibly say this is with certainty what you're going to do when nothing in your background supports this contention? A couple of things that I think you would want to stay away with. I think there's a strong desire by prospective students to impress us in their personal statement. And they do so in a way that really reflects a lack of knowledge. And what I mean by this is that sometimes you will see a personal statement that basically the author is singing outside of her range, if you will. Okay. She's using words that she's probably not very comfortable with. She figures that, look, if the word is a synonym and it's in the thesaurus, then I can just replace this word with that word. And sometimes it doesn't really work that well. And you're like, okay, they're saying words that just don't make sense. And you're thinking about if you're a jury member and you're hearing an attorney using a word incorrectly over and over again because you think this attorney is trying to flatter you with this 4-syllable word, it's killing the case. That's going to be the thing that sticks out of your mind. So I always say, sing within your range. Okay, know thyself. That's not speaking from your own perspective with your own voice. Okay, know thyself. The other thing that I'll notice is students will use complex compound sentences, these long drawn out sentences, as if, that somehow reflects profundity of thought. No, this is not a research paper. This is about giving us a perspective on your life and the decision you're making about going to law school. It could be simple and clear. That's what you need. That can be as effective as these long, drawn out sentences. So I tell students, try not to, don't be desperate, if you will, in your efforts to try to impress us. You know, there's a joke saying from an old movie that I love, that desperation is the world's worst cologne. You know, and it's just, there's something off
I love
about
that.
that person who's just be authentic, be real. So that's the thing. I think the other thing too is sometimes people will have people read their essay. It may make a lot of sense to them, but it's not coherent. You know, they're throwing everything in there and it kind of rambles on, and it's not giving us a good sense about this student. Again, you're trying to give the impression that you were meant to go to law school. And so you want to ask someone to read this and say whether or not this actually reflects. Does this capture what I think it's capturing? Things that I love analogies. I love people who use analogical thinking in their personal statement. They're drawing connections between things that on the surface may be very separate, very distinct. This shows me this person's got perspective, that they're seeing the world with their eyes of their eyes. And that's important because these are the students as well as classmates we want in the classroom, exchanging ideas and discussing the law. Okay, so that's another thing that I would want to see. I love seeing. I don't want everyone racing out to do analogies. Sometimes they don't work well. You have to know whether or not it works. But I find those to be very attractive as well. The last thing I will say, you know, there's a tendency people want to impress in the admissions committee. And so what they'll do with the personal statement is just throw everything about themselves into that personal statement. Every wonderful thing that they have ever achieved, every accolade and so forth. You don't really get a sense, a connection with that student when they do this. And I'll use an example that a colleague of mine at UC Berkeley used to say. He's like, when I feel like I'm reading applications, I feel like it's speed dating. And I kind of laughed about that, you know, and I'm like, well, I've never done that, but I can appreciate the metaphor that he's using here. And I'm thinking about myself as I'm sitting across this person and I'm trying to impress this person. Do you think I'm going to impress this person just rattling off everything I've done in life? Or if I do a deep dive into something specific? And you're going to make a connection when you do that deep dive. So what I tell students is don't throw everything in some sort of episodic, kind of chaotic cornucopia, if you will, of accolades and accomplishments. Instead, let the resume do that for you. Instead, focus on one thing. Go in depth, because that's what people are going to remember. That one story, not a rambling that goes from A to B as quickly as possible. So those are some of my do's and don'ts.
I love that. One of the things you touched on is the topics that, pull on the heartstrings, right? And I believe in this climate, just my personal perspective, a lot of, social justice aspects, right? And with that being said, within the last, I would say last 2 years or so, that's been concentrated just with the country. It's been concentrated and heavily focused on, what kind of advice would you give to folks who are looking to go in that direction of social justice? But I know that some folks say, hey, you might want to be careful with how you frame it, because there's just so many people that want to focus on that specific topic. How would you suggest that they make it stand out, their story stand out?
Well, I mean, if their aspirations of this, I mean, to me, I want to know, where did this emerge? Where did this come up? For some people, they've witnessed injustices either firsthand or secondhand. And that those experiences stayed with them, and they're going to continue with them. And so their desire to work on behalf of public interest or social justice is motivated and anchored by real experience. But let's say that isn't part of you. Well, your background, well, first of all, don't make it up and don't generalize it, based upon what you've read. My sense of it is that your motivation should be based upon something that happened experientially. For me, reading a book on the ills of society, it might light a bit of a spark, but it's not going to be a flame. You need to further that. You need to put air to that ember and let it get hotter. And that means, okay, if you want to work on behalf of social justice, do something prior to the application. prior to the application, looking at the number of people who have an interest in going into social justice or doing something with a law degree that's related to social justice and what they end up doing the law once there's a big discrepancy between the two. And now that isn't because people are disingenuous. It's also there are economic considerations and so forth that are at play. Okay. But I would say, look, if you're making a case that this is what you want to do with a law degree, you need to convince us that this is something you have taken time to really explore outside of books. And I would say that for anything that they were talking about doing, I would say the same thing about just going to law school. I wouldn't be motivated. I would tell someone I would want you to vet or, really reconsider your motivations for going to law school if your motivation is something you've seen on TV. Oh, I watched Law and Order and now I want to be a lawyer. Yeah, there's a lot that you don't get from watching that movie. There's a lot that you're not going to get about social justice issues that you're not going to get from a book. So how is this somehow grounded in your experience, in your lived experience, as we now say? And that's an important thing. Otherwise, I wouldn't spend too much time in a personal statement talking about all the things you can do with your law degree down the other end of 3 years. Tell us more about why the law, just in general, knowing that in most cases, what your ideas of what you're going to do going into law school will change by the time that you finished even your first year. So I would also stay away. You never know what side of the argument you're going to be on. And that's the thing about the way you train attorneys, and so you come in thinking real thick notions of justice, and I'm going to do this. I think one of the things that the first year experience will definitely uncouple that, for better or for worse. So I'd say don't be so heavy-handed, in terms of kind of in a dogmatic way about it's important that that there are injustices in the world and that a law degree might be allow for you in your own way to help remedy those injustices. But I think there has to be a certain level of humility, and some sense of sobriety about what a legal education is going to do. You're not sitting down and looking at cases and asking, okay, students, is this a just decision or justice rarely even comes up in your first year in law school. So be mindful about what you're getting yourself into. I mean, in terms of what the teachers are teaching, they're not asking you, okay, ladies and gentlemen, was this appellate decision a just decision? That's just not part of the way that we train attorneys to think like attorneys. And I think it's important that students recognize this when we're embarking upon their legal education. But having your motivations for law school really play a part. They don't work for you or against you in the application process. But if you're making a case, how are you supporting your assertions, your contentions? That's what I'm going to be looking for. And if I feel like this person really doesn't know what she's talking about, or she's just trying to play to the more noble aspect, then you might get docked because you're not being genuine. And I think that's what you don't want to be, is disingenuous or insincere in the application process.
Wow, incredible. Well, I want to touch just briefly on addendums, right? I think folks either they put too little or they give you their life story in addendums. So what tips would you have for folks with an addendum? What is the addendum designed to do that you think that's either a hit or miss for folks?
Yeah.
Like the LSAT, people typically use it for the LSAT score. If they had a low LSAT score, they want to explain that. If they had, maybe a low GPA, they want to explain that, right? That's what it's designed to do. But I find that people grapple with what exactly do you want me to explain? What exactly should I say? What's too much?
Yeah. Well, we request, letters, recommendations, transcripts, personal statement, because we believe that, all in all, these are sufficient for most students to be able to make their case. Okay. An addendum really is not, a part that everyone needs to submit. Oh, well, they give me another opportunity to explain more about myself. No, you should be able to explain really all you need to say really in your personal statement. However, there are cases where there are gaps or something in the background that the admissions committee needs to know, but may not be aware of simply in reading the application. So for example, you mentioned the LSAT. We will get a number of people who write about their inability to do well on a standardized examination. Again, you're making a case, and it's easier to state than it is to show. Okay, in this case here, you want to show if a student is saying something about, oh, I don't do well on standardized examinations, give us a copy of your SAT or ACT scores. And then we will see the GPA and we can make our own decision, our own inferences like, look, this standardized test did not really predict this person's performance at IPY, just for example. So that is a great example of where an addendum might be helpful. Now let's say that you also some students will say, okay, another popular addendum would be why they didn't do well in their first year. Okay, they may have gone pre-med, they want to help people, and a lot of people go to law school want to be helpers and help people, but they thought maybe they could do it as a doctor, and they realized after taking biochemistry and physics and calculus, this was just not for them, and they've gotten all C's. And then after that, they get into political science or economics or something, and the upward trajectory is pretty sharp, and you see A's. Well, to me, if you write an addendum about that first year, what I always encourage students to do is don't tell me why you did so poorly. Okay, or don't spend too much time talking about why you did so poorly. Tell me how you got back into the groove. How did you adapt? How did you learn to cope with the situation? Because that resilience, that tenacity, that ability to cope and to adapt are going to be important skills that people are going to need to have, not only as law students, but as attorneys. So this gives you an opportunity not only to talk about all your kind of new techniques and approaches to studying that help you get on your feet. It actually is telling us what kind of student you're going to face, because most law students will experience some sort of academic adversity while they're in their first year. They're taking courses that are incredibly challenging and really require them to study and to think in ways that they weren't accustomed to doing. So in many people, it's a novel situation. So in this case here, what you don't want to do is like, well, I didn't like my first year classes. I found that the classes were boring. My professor, these were all negative about why you didn't do well that first time, or in that first semester or first year. Spin it. Make sure that you talk about how you got yourself back on your feet. And the same is true for people who take the LSAT. Don't tell me all the reasons why you did so poorly the first time. Now, I'm not saying don't mention them. Sometimes the person chewing gum next to you or something like that might have been a distraction. However, talk about what you did to improve your performance the second time. That's what we're going to remember about you. We're going to look at your highest score anyways. But wow, Jocelyn, she really did. She rolled up her sleeves and she found different approaches. She knew that she was psyching herself out, and then she realized this and she made a tactical turn in her approach to taking the LCT, and there she gets a 10-point curve. Not only do you have a 10-point jump on your LCT, but now we know something about those abilities that we think are going to be essential for your success in law school. Now, so what you don't want to do, I think the addendum is making sure that you don't leave any guesswork to any gaps that we might see in your academic performance. Maybe there was a family tragedy. You had all good grades in your junior year. You had a bunch of C's. That will stand out. We will know what happened there. Okay. Having a addendum to explain, as you might see, my junior year, I didn't do too well when my parents were getting divorced. So that's where it comes in. We also know that for people writing a diversity addendum. So in this case, they want to explain something beyond their personal statement about their background and the potential for to contribute in a unique way to the law school. These are hit or miss. Sometimes people just repeat what they've said in the personal statement, which is basically just taking up more of the court's time. But if it's a compliment, or maybe they didn't want to talk about the adversity and the distress and the difficulty of growing up in their personal statement, they want it to be a little more, uplifting. That, gives us that can be very helpful. But whatever you do in a diversity statement, don't start off with saying, unlike the rest of your students. Okay. You don't know that. You can't make that claim. It doesn't help in making a claim that you can't support because you have no way of knowing. So I would always encourage someone who's doing the diversity statement, use this as a compliment. Don't allow it to be simply repeating yourself as if we're not going to get it the first time. And let it compliment and maybe provide us a little bit deeper background about you, but don't just repeat yourself. That doesn't help the case.
Well, wow, you hit it right on the money, right on the money. Just in our last few minutes, I wanted to give you the floor to, maybe cover something that we may have not covered, or just give, that student out there that's looking at IU Maurer and saying, this looks like a school for me. What were your final thoughts that you would like to leave with the audience before we wrap up?
Well, I do your research, you do your homework, about where to apply to law school. Your search for the best law school should always be understood as the best law school for you. Know something about yourself, be confident, about yourself, and really know thyself. Self-knowledge is an important factor that I'm looking at it throughout this case. Does this person know himself? Does she know herself? Use good judgment when crafting your case. Know who your witnesses should be. Okay. Rely on people who can say something substantively about you, who know you. Don't do it because they might be the most popular professor on the campus. Know when to turn your application in. How you conduct yourself with the admissions folks, even the frontline person, can be vitally important. Okay. I know the person who picks up the phone may not be answering or reading applications, but that person, if you really are nasty to that person because they're the frontline person, you will start seeing your chances of being admitted to a law school, especially like Maurer, where collegiality is very important, start to diminish. Okay. Take time to visit the school. Take us up on the offer to visit. I think it's always important. Don't just rely on what I have to say about the law school. I think most admissions deans would like to say that, it's kumbaya at the law school and everyone's so friendly, but come see for yourself. I always say, as an attorney, you're going to need to be an investigative creature. You need to scout things out. Start behaving like an attorney as you're scouting out what kind of law schools you want to go to, and really, really assess those reasons that you believe are motivating to attend law school. Be true to thyself. You need to be true to yourself. The unhappy law students are the ones who weren't true to themselves. They just figured, oh, I like to argue and I went to law school because I like to argue, or maybe I didn't know what else to do. Those are the unhappy law students, and they become the unhappy attorneys. Don't be an unhappy attorney, and don't be an unhappy law student. Do your homework now.
Do your homework and be true to thyself. Well, folks, you heard it. You heard it right here on LSAT Unplugged. Thank you so much for joining us. Also, check out the LSAT Unplugged channel for more interviews and tips on navigating your law school admissions journey. And thank you to Dean Canada. This has been totally amazing. See y'all next time.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me.